We are back in a critical move, Niger, uranium, and French neocolonialism. We want to add a recommendation because its author is with us together in the study, Yoslan Silverio Gonzalez, who is professor, researcher of the Center of International Politics and chief of the Africa Middle East group. The book is called Crisis versus Stability. In Chapter 7, he talks about Niger, crisis toward transition, a new stable periods. We're going to see how the author responds to this. It describes several negotiations between the governments and French company Areva for it to stop taking all of the exploitation of uranium and pay royalties. After some problems after 2014, this company accepted to finance a road in the north of the country known as the Uranium Road and an agriculture program. As of then, it seems a new phase started between the government and foreign companies. This is our recommendation and presentation of the guest today. Welcome. Thank you very much for your invitation. We're going to share first material for context related to the first factor we said, interdependent, related to many others when we describe the panorama. Uranium is naturally radioactive, which discovery was made by a German scientist. It is used for the elaboration of bombs and explosives, and it's mainly used to shield tanks and bullets. Niger has much uranium in its soils, but it is very poor at the same time. Some talk about the paradox and others about the evil uranium. Niger is the main exporter of uranium and the fourth main producer with 300 annual tons, which represents 48% of the foreign income. After 2017 in Asali, they discovered a little more than 10 reserves. Nevertheless, the social situation is terrible. According to a UN program of 2006, life expectancy is barely 45 years. More than 70% of the adults are illiterate, and most of the population live under $2 per day. The conditions and the exploitation have been usually granted to foreign companies that do not respect nature. Many organizations complain about the working conditions and the radioactive contents of the water. The companies have occupied ancestral territories, and this has caused serious political tensions. The Nigerian movement by justice claims compliance with the agreements of 95% reached between the government Tuaregs and the transfer of 50% of the income to local communities, respecting autochthonous movements and the end of the practice of exploitation without license. Well, if somebody connects at this time and did not listen to the presentation of our guest, I remember Yoslan Silverio Gonzalez, deputy investigator of the Investigation Center for Africa and Middle East in Cuba. Welcome, Yoslan. We have been sharing with you some lectures, workshops, and we know that you have lots of material and you have investigated on the topic. To place in context, I would first like to talk about the internal political situation. We first said that it's a country that has had many coups, as other African countries. In 2011, a civilian government started that I understand was re-elected and it remains in office. Is there stability or not? Yes, that's a question which answer is quite complicated. How can you define political stability in Africa? Africa. I always like to talk about historic perspectives because when we see the political situation in the case of Niger in the 60s, 70s, 80s, that was characterized by constant coups, and you see the current situation in the 21st century, there is a progression, an improvement in the political institution, not only Niger, but other African countries. The fact of not having other coups is a sign that speaks in favor of the fact that the militaries have taken a specific situation, have accepted elections, and lets us know that it is in multi-party elections, which was implemented in Africa as of the 90s, which caused great conflict in the continent as well. But the African political systems have adjusted and adapted to these elections that are part of the democratic game that the West has imposed in Africa under strong political conditions. We're making a summary of history that's quite interesting. In the case of Niger, you mentioned the Tuareg population in the north and this rebellion between 2007 2009 that was a very unstable and insecure period in Niger, but also all the Saharan zone. But we must also mention, in the case of periods before this, we had the government of Mama Butanya that was also civilian Democrat that remained 2 terms, but that in a given time reformulates the Nigerian system to remain in office, and this created strong tensions inside the country that caused the coup of 2010. So as of then, there was a political transition where the military conducted this transition and reconfigured the political forces inside the country, and there were new elections were organized that resulted in the current government of Yusufu. This is interesting because in this African context, we think how a government that implemented certain economic policies, for example, the rebirth program related to the improvement of infrastructure in the north of Niger, which has been abandoned by former governments, a program that is related to guaranteeing food security in this population, because we're talking a semi-desert zone. It has to do with climate change, or it rains a lot or it doesn't rain, the crops are affected, and this creates food safety issues. So the government of Isufu has developed an interesting policy that can be analyzed in different points of view, because it could generate debt or many variables that you can establish. But the fact is that the policy has been effective, and this helped him reach his second term with the support of the population. This is the political context where we can summarize the current situation of Niger. So there is, you're asking me if there's stability? I would say yes, because in spite of all the regional insecure context, perhaps we can talk a little more about terrorism, etc. The Nigerian government has managed that a certain stability in its institutions, government, guaranteeing border security, although we know it's not easy. Before going to this that seems to cross-cut everything uranium, I would like to ask you if these inter-ethnical conflicts conveniently used by the Western world to sell the image of these poor warriors that are unable to understand each other, does this apply in Niger? Are there inter-ethnic conflicts? It could be because it also has to do with the Tuareg population. When we look at the ethnical, social component of this Saharan population, you find the Tuareg that are different from Mali, Algeria, and colonization was a very important factor in this, because since the French colonization in this zone and later the independence in the 60s, the Tuareg population was divided between these countries, and therefore the political elites that are established in the southern capitals, thinking in Mali, from Bamako or Niger, we find contradictions between those African elites with regards to the Tuareg population that lives in these semi-desertic zones. So these are a permanent source of conflicts that until now there have been conciliation times, but it's important to understand this because the borders established between Mali, Niger, Algeria are borders that do not have any sense for that population. This is another concept I was working, the porous borders, because the borders are permeable. They move from one place to another because beyond the trans-Saharan roads, there is no effective control. Why is the reason of those borders imposition? Especially French colonization, especially because it's the main Saharan desert. These countries do not have the military capacity of controlling the borders. Besides the creation of the so-called national states, that was also an imposition of European powers, do not have the strict sense with which we know in Europe or in America. Of course, more than 50 years of independence have elapsed, and they have adapted a national feeling. But in any case, there are ethnical tensions between the Tuareg population, and this is why we also talk about the complexity of African conflicts, because it's not only ethnical factor. There are resources also, which is the core of this program, and they always want to appear the problem as only an ethnical problem. And in this case, resources play an important role because the struggle that the Tuareg have held for a better distribution of wealth. Well, Niger does not escape this capitalistic exploiting world that takes away the wealth of the people without giving them any percentage. On the contrary, we see that the contrary happens here. What is the history of uranium in Niger? Well, uranium is one of the most important strategic resources that is not only in Niger but also in Chad. It was discovered by the French in the end of the 50s, and therefore we're talking about French colonized zone. It is understood that France has historic control of commercialization. It was discovered a little before the independence. Yes, colonial empires started becoming independent as of the 60s. And therefore, here we should mention, we must talk about political independence of these countries, but from the economic point of view, France never withdrew. They continued controlling not only resources, but finances, because we have to talk about the franc, which is a currency imposed by France in all these French francophone countries. And the central bank has a policy on this currency. Therefore, we must see that these governments do not have capacity to carry out financial policies. So these are structural policies these countries have, always related to colonialism and how France implemented not only these commercial agreements sponsored by the EU, but also military agreements. So when allegedly France withdraws from these territories, it executes defense and military agreements with all these governments. And this allows us to understand why France, from Senegal to Chad, has military bases deployed throughout this Saharan region. So the control is not only economic, financial, or transnational, but it is also supported in a military deployment. You also talked about the role and the possibility of the governments changing this relation. The problem is that when an African government tried to revert this economic situation, France immediately eliminated those leaders that were leftist. Then in the 90s, they implemented neoliberalism. This is an objective reality in the African continent that was imposed by Europe and the United States. So if you didn't make economic and political structural reforms, you were not considered democratic and were subject to sanctions by the EU or to the commercial agreements. So in this multidimensional context at the economic security levels, what capacity did do the African countries have to confront the transnationals? We're talking about Uranium Arevalo multinational, but there's also oil, US, Exxon, British Petroleum, because there are also oil, gas, and gold. All this strip in the Saharan from Mauritania, Mali, there is oil in Niger. Even if they don't have commercial volumes, there is oil, and there's uranium in Chad. And Chad is also concentrates a large amount of oil resources that are extracted by a duct controlled by U.S. companies that goes out through Cameroon. So we must understand this dynamic in a sub-regional fashion. If we focus only in one country, we lose the relation with the neighbor countries, French interests in other countries, and we lose perspectives of the financial, economic, and control. But in spite of all this, there is a policy of African governments to try to change this relation somehow, a social policy, and advance in integration. We cannot say that only that African governments are not doing anything. The thing is that we must analyze this economic, political context. We will understand it better. Has there been a change regarding the bids or concessions of uranium in that country? When they discovered the first reserves, it was in time of French colonization. Can we talk about continuity of that colonization or neocolonialism? But I want to ask you about the concessions. Has there been any change as of the demands from some movements? The problem is that multinationals have always tried to impose agreements that benefit them against the governments, regardless of where, Latin America, Africa, in all developing countries. In the case of agreements, especially uranium exploitation, only this French multinational had the obligation of returning 5% of the income of uranium trade, so they remain with more than 80% of income. That's why we talked about the Niger regional political context, because with this new government in 2014, a new negotiation was made with Areva, the French state multinational that exploits uranium all over the world, whereby that percentage increased to 12% from 5.5, which was a historic contribution to the Nigerian state, they increased to 12%. So there is an improvement. This also talks about the work of the Niger's government to recover a little. Does that calm tensions a little? It could be, because this is always together with the policies I mentioned about development programs in the north. We must see if this will remain or not. This is something that it is still in development. Now, in the article we were quoting at the beginning in El Orden Mundial, there's a warning of a possible demographic explosion. It says Niger has the world's highest fertility rate. The average of children per woman is above 7, quite a lot. According to UN projections, Niger's population, a little more than 22 million, will triplify by 2050. If prognosis comply, there will be more than 190 million of Nigerians. It's a demographic bomb that, united to the neighbor countries' perspectives, could endanger the sustainable development of the entire Sahel and aggravate the threats that exist. This is what they say. I want to read your opinion. That isn't a merely Occidental approach. When you mentioned the quote of Macron, he said that the problem of African development was demographic. Too many people. Well, that's not an explanation to the problem. The problem is the economic underdevelopment and the overexploitation of resources, because the world has resources for the people. The problem is the unequal distribution of wealth, and this is why they say that population is the problem. That is not the real problem. But, of course, the African continent has a trend to increase population, young population. But I repeat, that is a position that comes from the West. There are natural resources, there's money, there is capacity of confronting the demand of population. There are people to confront. I am against that approach, that the problem is focused on the growth of population. We have to make a pause. We have advanced a little because of the close relation between these foreign companies in France, because Areva is French. We're going to deepen on France and IMF, two allegedly institutions that bring down fires and have, of course, economic interests. We will be back after this pause. We are back with our critical move of Telesur, Nigeria, uranium, and French neocolonialism. What has, as with all its French colonies, France has become a pragmatic neocolonialism. We could call it like this, even if several leaders deny it. The truth is that, in practice, this European power has made its backyard with great earnings the typical imperial vision. The French boot and the IMF have lots to say about the current situation in Niger. After the 90s, the 70s, the prices went up, the demand dropped and changed things. The external debt grew considerably, and governments were compelled to accept the IMF adjustments. Student and workers' demonstrations grew. In the north, the Tuareg confronted the army and demanded more participation. The army decided to devote more than 32% of the national budget to agrarian policy against drought. Situation certainly improved and tensions fell, but after the 90s, the IMF came back with new structural adjustments that brought the country to a serious situation. The Tuareg continued demonstrating, and unlike the 80s, they signed a peace agreement where the government committed to decentralization and devote assistance to more than 700,000 Tuaregs. They barely absorb 5% of French exports, and France takes away 95% of their production. The uranium is extracted by French company Areva that uses 2/3 of France's electricity, and this is why it is interested in controlling the north of Mali, the border with Niger, to secure the situation. France takes advantage of the crisis of their colonies to advance in strategic positions. Energy security of France depends on Niger. We will develop this topic with Joslan Silverio Gonzalez, member of the International Investigation Center of Cuba, expert in Africa. I was saying that France's energy security depends on Niger. Perhaps this explains the colonialism. Yes, France extracts a good part of uranium with which it uses to generate electricity in France. And therefore, we're talking about an essential interdependence. What happens in Niger is a matter of security for France. Is France controlling the borders? That is related with the military topic, and there are other factors that are in the game. There are also terrorist groups. We have not talked about that, but I would like to, because when the conflict appeared in the north of Mali in 2012, 2013, and the French military presence there, part of these terrorist groups linked or not to Al-Qaeda kidnapped French personnel, had actions against the mines and companies, and the affiliates of Areva that are exploiting in the north of Niger. And this also explains why France automatically played a very important role in intervention in the north of Mali. So the instability did not trespass the border with Niger. And because, as we said, there is a close interconnection with what happens in Mali and what happens at Niger. And this is why France made its moves within the UN Security Council and took with it several African countries and created a very delicate security situation in all this zone. So in every situation of crisis, without need to know the reasons of the different crises, the French army appears as the only guarantor of peace and security, but in truth it has been an opportunity for France to keep its geostrategic interests. Exactly, and this has also been supported by the European Union because it has a security strategy for the Sahel, which is the political framework that legitimizes them to be present there. So when you see this document of 2011, they establish all the problem in the Sahel, and this is a way of legitimizing their presence, besides the fact that France are there since 1960. They never left. There's a discussion on the number of military bases because during the crisis in the north of Mali, France France established forces to stop that crisis. When they guaranteed, allegedly, security in the north of Mali, France launches Operation Balkan against terrorism. That includes all the Sahelo-Saharan zone. And we're talking about the government of François Hollande, and that Macron continued. So what France did was reposition its military forces in the Sahel zone and started creating military units, for example, in the north of Agadez, and in Faya-Largeau, north of Chad, and Niamey. It has military bases. We haven't talked about the United States. I would like to talk. In Mali as well. So there's a reposition of French military forces in this zone. How many effective do they have? It's a question. The French security services will not reveal how many troops they have, and since they move them all over constantly, and they incorporate missions of alleged peace missions of the United States. Yes, there are the military troops, but you never know how many people are linked to the security, secret services, civilians linked to military action. So when we see the struggle, it's much more than 3,000, 4,000 soldiers. We haven't talked of Carnet-Mounier, that was a French base in Djibouti, but it's a country where France and the United States and other countries have military presence. So if we would look at the map, it's a corridor of instability that goes from Mauritania to Sudan. We haven't talked about Sudan, but it is related. So the line of conflicts and resources. So there go the military bases of France, but together with France, the European Union also have their military and civilian forces deployed. But according to, after the crisis in Mali, the Europeans established several missions. There's the mission to train the armed forces of Mali in the north of that territory, and there you find the training Koulikoro base, a city in the center of Mali, where the Spanish are one of the main European actors with military presence after France. And are there disputes of these actors for the territories? No, because they have a certain synergy of interest between France, the European Union, and the United States. And I say European Union because the UE creates its own mechanism, but France also has its own interests. For example, I always explain to my students, France doesn't have to wait the consensus of the 27 or 28 members of UE to create a military mission in the territory. It's a member of the Security Council. So France has never left, and it won't leave either. No. The thing is that France took the rest of the EU Union to support the financial logistic aspect, and then there's a superposition of military positions. So we have civilian, military, and European forces. In the case of Niger, there's UCAP Niger that went there in 2011, related to training of African armies. So they have an intentional policy, European policy, and even the United States, of supporting, and I quote, the logistical, financial, and training of African armies. And this is very interesting because they change the policy, but there's a synergy between these international actors. I remember we were discussing about Brexit and what this could mean. The Brexit will not necessarily mean that the British troops in Africa will leave. That is another actor that participates in that sector in Africa also, that never left in spite of all the independence process. I would like to ask about the African alliance, the different union mechanisms. Have there been actions addressed to change this panorama and revert the situation? If you're referring to African Union as a continental consultation mechanism, it has its own mechanisms. It has the Security Council of the African Union, which is related to conflicts and political crisis in Africa. But inside the complex African Union, there are the sub-regional relations. And in our case, in the Sahel, we have to mention CDA for Western Africa and SEAC for Central Africa, that must take charge not only of the economic aspect, but also security. Now, what is happening now? It has to do with agreement mechanisms. As the terrorist forces deployed, there were ad hoc groups that were created that are in charge of security in Sahel. So the joint force of G5 in Sahel, which is composed by the 5 Sahel countries affected by terrorism, where France has been promoted the articulation of this ad hoc security mechanism, allegedly for Africans to put the troops and be at the first row of combat against terrorism, allegedly. And France, besides deploying their military there, they are logistically supporting these troops, advising and training. So the great problem here, and it is part of France's pressures to these African governments, that it is compelling African countries to increase state budgets for security and defense matters. So there's a matter of financing here, and this is one of the pressures that the government of Macron has trying to promote. And there is no consensus regarding the articulation of this joint force of the Sahel G5. And there's another mechanism, everything around the Chad Lake that Chad, Niger, Cameroon, Nigeria shares. A multinational force was created between these countries to combat Boko Haram. Since these are multinationals, it addresses both regions. So mechanisms like CDA or CEPAC have had to transfer their security functions to both blocks, both G5 Sahel or the struggle against Boko Haram. So as you can see, there are complex interest actors, institutions, and organizations that interact in this region. But undoubtedly, France and the United States here have the military control of everything. And I would like to talk about the United States because it's not aligned to this reality. To talk about history, we should mention that since 2003, United States had launched the Pan-Sahel initiative, Struggle Against Terrorism, in the countries of the Sahel zone. This was under Bush government, and in 2005, they created the initiative, the Trans-Saharan Initiative, Struggle Against Terrorism, that expanded the number of countries that were benefited with U.S. budget to struggle against terrorism. And in 2007, they created AFRICOM, that closed the cycle in security and defense. More recently, I've had some information about that. United States, with Donald Trump, is building a military base in the Lagades zone that is supposed to be the largest they have in Africa after the one they have in Djibouti. Since it's a broad semi-desert zone, the United States is trying to implement this military bases to carry out intelligence actions with drones in all the zone of Sahel, because Djibouti is far away, almost 3,000 kilometers away. In Djibouti, they control with drones all the African Horn and the Arabic Peninsula, Somalia, and Yemen, which has been broadly criticized because of the indiscriminate attacks of drones against allegedly militaries of Chad, but it also affects civilian population. So they are building this base in Niger to monitor the terrorist groups that displace throughout the Sahel zone. They're even talking about more penetration, military penetration in the United States. So, as you can see, it's not only France, it's not only the European Union, but also the United States. And if you ask me how many soldiers the United States has there, there's no security in this sense either, because they were talking about 800 effectives only in Lagadais in Niger. But there's no safe source because there are contractors, U.S. aid, intelligence, counterintelligence. So it's much more than the militaries that wear uniforms and those who don't. Now, as a conclusion, what factors must be united to improve things? Well, it's a very complex situation because of the amount of factors that are involved in this region: terrorism, traffic, all the transnational crime networks, migration, drug, the borders, interethnic groups between Tuaregs and Arab groups, desertification. There's such complexity in this zone that this legitimates military presence, because I repeat, the solution to a security problem is always military. It's not an integral solution to solve the economic problems this zones have, to stop migration, to avoid recruitment of people. The internal budget depends mainly on foreign assistance, yes. And African governments that do not have capacity for national security are compelled to depend on these foreign governments. Thank you very much for your participation. We now go to our final ideas and conclusions with all this information we've explained today. The origin of the crisis, as always, is in the geostrategic significance that, in this case, Niger has, located in the heart in the Saharan Strip. Discovered in 1957 in times of French colonization, uranium, instead of becoming a source of wealth development in favor of the people, has been traditionally the source of internal disputes, subject of the greed of foreign companies, and a barrier to development and social cohesion. If we look close, the line of conflict is the same for strategic resources and military bases established throughout time by powers who have interests. There have been governmental internal efforts that must be considered but are insufficient, and in the short term, because of external pressure and the dependence, especially from France and the United States, that have growing military presence. We have now concluded our critical move. Thank you very much for trusting us. We'll meet again next week.
Local Caracas, Venezuela. Nos estamos viendo.